differently, because our title here today is Euro-Mediterranean Politics and the Challenge of Regional Diversity and Fragmentation. I would also add mutation to that list. Things that look like something familiar or recognizable today often mutate into something different, and I think the whole history of Daesh, which we've discussed at great length already, reflects some of that. The bit I'd like to focus on, though, is the politics. We could have called this session relations or engagements, but politics, in the best sense of the word, seems to me precisely what's missing from this relationship. And I would like to start by reflecting and paying tribute to the opening panel of yesterday, which I think in a very sobering way, with very sober details, actually established exactly where we are today, with a lack of vision, a lack of leadership, and above all, a lack of understanding of just how interconnected cause and effect is across the whole region. I agree with those who have said, both in written and spoken commentary, things have never been so bad as they are now. However, if we're going to focus on incentives for doing things differently, we can't just sit and accept this as a form of defeatism. And my first observation is also that negatives never make for good policy. Complexity, as we know, is very much harder to come to grips with than problems depicted in very black and white terms. And again, I think it's not just me that's observed this, but one of the reasons European governments have leapt into the breach over Daesh is it's very much easier to depict Daesh as a force of evil to their publics or their doubting parliaments or Congress, in the case of the US, than it is to engage in the complexity where there are many grey areas, even though I think we heard from our Syrian colleague yesterday that actually what we have totally overlooked is the rightness of the cause who are fighting, of those fighting and protesting for democracy in Syria. We ourselves, in many ways, have turned that conflict into a grey area. And even the Barcelona process, which we've heard reviewed just now, which will be 20 years old if it still exists, it's also mutated into something else, 20 years old next year, was in many ways, in practice, sadly, based on negative incentives rather than positives. Its preamble was full of discussions about common history, common values, common ground, common projects, and yet it failed to disguise in its implementation the lack of impetus to build on those common interests in its implementation. I think those who've heard me speak before, I always refer back to a phrase I've never forgotten, having actually, sadly, I'm old enough to have been at the original Barcelona conference, of a French diplomat who, in a throwaway comment, said, you know what this is about? It's assistance caritative pour les fixer chez eux. That's what it was about. It was about migration, stopping it, controlling it, terrorism, stopping it, controlling it, and security. And yes, I pay homage to everything that's been done in the way of economic cooperation, and in particular under the European neighbourhood policy. The problem is they are not visible, the initiatives that take place. They're often not acknowledged. They're often meshed in to the fabric of what is already going on. And they lack champions and leaders in the visible, if you like, political sphere, the best side of politics. Barcelona, at least at the beginning, had several champions, not least of all a very strong championship from Spain, the Spanish state, the Spanish foreign minister, and indeed the Spanish foreign ministry. There was a lot of work went on to make sure not only that Barcelona was put together to start with, there was also a very prominent German diplomat that we know as well, who was involved in the design of this. I don't see who these champions are now. So in order to look at this afresh and do something new, I think with thanks to Brahim, we've already analysed the ENP. That's not what I choose to do. I would like us, particularly on the European side, to reflect about the impact of what's happening in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, what impact it is actually having in Europe itself. And to do so, the negatives are very clear, but to do so in ways that actually look and seek for positives. In what ways Do we need a better relationship, that we will benefit from a better relationship with those states and societies to the south of the Mediterranean? And I'm sorry to say that most of our leaders within Europe have got themselves carried away with their own rhetoric on the threat that Daesh poses back in Europe. It is minimal. It is a criminal activity. It's a matter of policing and intelligence networks to track down however many of these several thousand at most jihadists who've left Europe to go to the region and may or may not come back. I've heard calculations that upwards of 60% are unlikely to come back. And we're not focusing on the well-being of millions of people on both, indeed all, sides of the Mediterranean. Now, who amongst us is actually championing them? One question is, could we not actually explore together shared challenges? I've been struck since before 2011 and have commented before on how the recession, unemployment, the financial crisis, which continues in Europe, is dealt with as though it's a matter which is completely divorced, separate, and dealt with by different people from the crises, which may be similar in scale, particularly in North Africa, where, fortunately for now, violence does not prime the way it does in the Levant area. But we talk about these areas, these challenges, youth unemployment, insertion, political challenges, the lack of accountability of governments, as though they're completely different sets of circumstances. It would help us all, I think, if we looked at this, as I think Fouad said over lunchtime, as a problem of modernization. It's also a problem of globalization. When I go back to the UK, we will still be debating the fallout from the Scottish referendum. You have a debate which is still in the making here. We're talking about democracy in Europe. Democracy, if not in crisis, it's being challenged as not responding to the needs of citizens. Why is this so different from the kind of debates we are having about what's happening in the Mediterranean region and in the Middle East? Again, it's a difference of scale, but I would say the tensions underlying it might best be addressed together rather than separately. And I think in this respect, again, we talk a lot about finding new frameworks, new visions, without recognizing that actually the tendency to bilateralism, which means relations between individual European states and their counterparts in the Middle East and North Africa, has intensified, whether it's through politics, whether it's through commerce, whether it's through heavy export marketing into the region, through actually seeking their own advantage rather than through multilateral institutions such as the European Union. And we're also living in a more multipolar region, which I won't comment on since Christina Kraus, who's here, has written a very good paper on this recently. But this is facing a crisis. This fragmentation could also be seen as an opportunity to do things differently. And one way I would suggest of doing it is less top-down initiatives formed in intergovernmental circles and more ways of thinking creatively about getting the active participation of citizens on both sides of the Mediterranean into resolving issues which directly affect them. They may affect them to a different degree, but I would suggest unemployment amongst the young in Spain is something which might best be addressed in terms of unemployment amongst the young also in the region. Could not joint initiatives be formed which address the needs of both sides? I think we haven't even begun to explore these seriously. And I say this because I think, again, one of the conclusions we seem to be reaching in terms of the fallout from the so-called Arab Spring is that people power is now in decline. We're in reversal, authoritarianism is back. I'm not so sure. I think violence, that we focus on a lot for obvious reasons because of its damaging effects, is only one manifestation of the positive diversity and fragmentation which is going on. There are a number of small-scale initiatives which often don't get captured, and for those who, like me, went back to read Asaf Bayev's great work life as politics after the Arab Spring, you know that these things are invisible as they're happening, but the networks which then manifest themselves later are nonetheless forming. And I think as a network we should be certainly paying more attention to the positive new ways of setting up economic models. I know Morocco is very active in this, in terms of social enterprises, in new ways of supporting startups. And again, it's individuals who are doing this. The governments in question may not necessarily be doing that much to help, or indeed blocking them, but where people have creative ideas and creative tendencies, a number of things, not enough, but a number of things are happening, and I would suggest over the longer term they will change things, just as over the long term, if the overall triggers for the Arab Spring, lack of representation, unemployment, economics, dignity, all the things we've discussed so far are not addressed, then surely history tells us the protests also do not go away, but they may come back in different forms. So given time constraints, I've got 6 bright ideas. I haven't got solutions, but 6 ideas of how to address things differently. The first one is to devolve. Goodbye top-down initiatives, goodbye intergovernmental seminars in which ideas are pulled together and the populations of Europe know nothing about them and the populations of North Africa and the Middle East know nothing about them. And I was inspired to hear at a meeting a number of us were at recently on the role that the OSCE might play within the Mediterranean, to hear the Russian ambassador say that the real problem is there are too many diplomats in the OSCE. Too many diplomats are controlling everything. And he's right, in a sense. With respect to the former and current diplomats here, there's only so much you can do. You definitely have a role. But when it comes to coordinating a number of issues across regions, why can't we focus more on devolving them? So if we're talking about setting up, strengthening, modernizing trade unions, for example, I know some of this happens already, but more resources should go into channeling those discussions to the places, to the people who actually know what they're talking about and who can actually share directly their own experience. This is true of devolved governance, city councils, regional governance, etc. And again, I'm inspired by Dina's comment just before in the previous session about patriarchy. Patriarchy needs breaking up, end of story. And it will be broken up because the sheer bulk of the population is now younger than the patriarchs. There are more women who are more vocal across the region. We all meet them, we know them, we know they are there. We have to stop saying, I think, we need to involve civil society and actually get precise about which bits of civil society, which bits of the economy, which bits of specialized networks need to meet. My second idea is we need to re-incentivize everybody. Too many of these discussions are based on negatives. I've already said that, and I understand exactly why that is. There is a lot of negativity, a lot of failed expectations, a lot of loss of life, particularly over the recent summer in the region. However, despite this, and certainly in the expatriate networks of Middle Easterners I see and meet in London, there's an awful lot of energy and people trying again. There's an awful lot of new entrepreneurialism. And I think what we need to do is get that energy in contact with equal entrepreneurial spirits, creativity on the European side. Again, this has to be devolved. There has to be new models, new ways of engaging people. My third big idea is put economics ahead of politics. Now, I know we've had this shot down over the years because the previous Barcelona process was criticised ad nauseum for favouring economics over politics, and look where it led us. It reinforced autocratic governments. What I mean by this is a different form of economics, an economics which is specifically targeted at empowering actors outside established elites. It's all about bringing new people on board, a new generation, new groups of people, bringing them into the economy. And again, those who've heard me speak before, and I'll say it again, is you will not have democracy anywhere in the region. We would not have had democracy in Europe if you did not have autonomous economic units, people who could defend themselves economically as well as politically. Because if you're employed by a government, you cannot hold them to account. Or if you try, you won't hold them to account for very long. How many ideas am I on? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think the role of the EU should change. It should become a facilitator. And one example of this is to facilitate and organise new ways of approaching and interacting with Syrian refugees. I'm shocked in the context of all the noise made about Daesh that the statistics of the European Union, the United Nations, I should say, at the end of August, that half of Syria's population are displaced internally, externally, unaccounted for. That's half a nation. They do not have enough money to keep the refugee camps going through the winter. We have to look at this situation differently. You cannot keep half a nation going on charity alone. Amongst those refugees, and when you talk about refugees, you talk about humanitarianism, you tend to lift the power of agency, if you like, from human actors. You are a victim, you are a refugee, you are a recipient of our aid, or external aid, rather than saying, actually, amongst these Syrian refugees, there are many qualified people, engineers, teachers, others. We need to engage, we the outsiders, much closer with those individuals to ask them, on a community basis, wherever they may be found, allow more people into Europe. And there are many ways to do this without it being a flood which is uncontrolled. Allow many more younger Syrians into educational establishments. Allow Syrian teachers to establish their own schools in the region or wherever they may be. But Syrians have to be treated, and I think we heard this very clearly yesterday, as political actors. I would argue they also have to be seen as economic actors. Things are not going to be resolved in a hurry, but if we have half a nation outside, displaced internally, externally, something needs to be given back to that population so they can design and have a role in their own future. Sorry, I'm losing track of points here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6. Yes, 5, 6, and then I'll stop. Number 5, we have to think of new ways of resolving conflicts. A couple of you here, I've had conversations about the possibility of things changing in the Eastern Mediterranean in terms of trade networks, in terms of business links. And the two examples I would give, despite all the crisis this summer, and one of the examples I'm going to give predates the summer, so things may have changed, but I doubt it. And the other one has been going on all the time. The first one is when I was in Jerusalem in May this year. Again, I was surprised to read in an English language press that the head of the Port Authority of Eilat had just signed an agreement with the mayor of Hebron to allow shipments from Dubai to pass through the port of Eilat to engage in trade in Hebron on the West Bank. Now, who would have thought that? This is against everything we say on the political side. This was merchandise which would travel through Israel to go to the West Bank and increase trade with the Gulf region. The second example I heard more recently is that of Turkish lorries that can no longer drive through either Syria or Iraq to get to Saudi Arabia. So what are they doing? They're being shipped to the port of Haifa, and they are driving with the plates on. The Israelis here can confirm whether they've seen any, but they have Turkish plates, and they're driving across Israel through Jordan to go to Saudi Arabia. Now, in our political discussions, do we ever capture this? Now, we need to dissect all this and say, is it a good or bad thing? Is this reinforcing elites? Is this just a privileged set of developments? I accept all that. But things are happening, and other things can happen below the radar, which might encourage things to improve in the region. And last but not least, since this is very close to my heart, we need to do more with, through, and increase the visibility of the cultural discussions that are going on. Now, we all know of the work of analysed, and they do very good work. The problem is, again, it's an intergovernmental process to a large degree, not entirely, and it tends to make culture a subject apart from our core subjects of geopolitics, the risk of instability, of conflicts. But it does mean in these discussions, all we discuss is the various dimensions of Islam, manifestations of Islam, sectarianism. We do not talk about the creativity which is very apparent when you go to certain parts of the region. Again, I'd nod in the direction of Morocco, but also Tunisia, Algeria, Libya until recently, poor Libya. But anyway, the meshing, if you like, of the cultural experiences, particularly amongst the young, drawn both from European sources and Islamic and their own local Christian and other sources, which gives rise to all sorts of really interesting dimensions, whether it's in film, whether it's in the fashion world, whether it's a creative way of doing online businesses, these new entrepreneurial initiatives, and it's done in a multilingual way. People are speaking English much more in regions where previously they only spoke French. There's an affirmation of what might otherwise, but aren't anymore thought of as minority languages, such as Amazigh. All these things need to be brought into these discussions, rather than just talking about the reductionism which is going on elsewhere in the discussions of Islam. So there we are, that's my bright ideas. I hope we can discuss some of them. You can shoot them all down in flames. It's just I didn't want to go back to analysing what we spent many years doing. We need different structures to address a completely different regional environment. We need to have new faces, new voices encouraged, and I think devolving away from these very top-down structures, which sadly have failed us. I think the definition of madness is often set out as trying to do the same thing all over again, expecting different results. We have to do things radically differently, and I hope this is the beginning of a debate within these networks towards that end.